Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for Podscribe's first benchmark report of 2026. My name is Christy May, and I am a product marketing manager here at Podscribe. And quickly, before we get started, just a few notes. This session is being recorded, and the recording along with the full report will be shared after. And because you've registered and are attending, you will be the first to receive it before it goes live publicly. And next, we would like this webinar to be very interactive. So if you have any questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature to submit questions throughout the webinar. We'll try to answer it live or we'll answer it typed out. And throughout this webinar, we'll also sprinkle in some polls. Don't worry, you won't miss it. And feel free to participate if you like. And on the topic of polls, we do have our first one. This is the question that we ask at every webinar. We just want to know if you've been here before or it's your first time. Oop. All
I
right.
always
The
want to
uh,
see
the
this
the
answer.
Adam McNeil question.
Yeah.
All
We
right,
might
let's
have
take
to
a look
get
at the
Adam on as
result.
a co-presenter for a future PPB.
Yeah.
He's probably got this locked down
That
by
would be
now.
fun.
Hey, half of you,
Oh,
this is your first
wow.
one.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. That's great to
Welcome.
have you.
Super exciting.
I still
Normally
love we
we
got
have a
three
lot of,
people. Three people been here every single time, and thank you so much for being back here every single time.
I'm very surprised by these answers.
Yeah. Thank you,
Love to
everyone.
see it.
Welcome. Yeah.
And thank you for the fans that are coming back for more each time. We love to see it. Really appreciate your attendance and the support. This is what drives us to creating these types of reports, right? And I know you're probably super familiar for those who've been here before about who we are, but for the ones who are new, we're Podscribe. We are the leading independent omni-channel measurement platform. So brands and agencies, as well as publishers, use us to easily identify and understand what's working and where to optimize when it comes to their audio strategy. One of the ways we share these insights is through our PPB report, also known as the Podscribe Performance Benchmark Report. And we publish these every quarter. We host a webinar. I'm really glad you're here. And this is the first time we're diving into the data for Q1 2026. This report itself is very lengthy, so we're only presenting a portion of it since we only have an hour. So we're just super excited to share some of the highlights with you today. And while I still have you, we are hosting a giveaway, a limited time offer. If you would post your thoughts on LinkedIn about this webinar or the report itself and tag us, we'll reach out and then connect and send you a free Podscribe performance, Nike performance cap as modeled by Cam here, if you can see him. It's the
Yeah, I'll be
Nike
there.
hat.
Only
It's
good,
really
only
nice.
only good thoughts. Only good thoughts, though.
Yeah.
We hear it's the best swag on the internet. So come one, come all, get your hat.
Exactly. All right. And now let me present to you our speakers for today. We have Pete, our founder and CEO. And then we also have Matt, our head of partnerships.
Everybody.
And last but not least, Cam, our senior director of partnerships. And I'm going to
Good to be
pass the
here.
virtual stage to Pete to dive into the report now.
Alrighty. Hello, all. Well, let's get into it. So each time when we're preparing for these report, we always try to brainstorm what new things can we report on here. We try not to just recycle the same stats because often they don't. Sometimes they shift a little, but often the core things don't need a quarterly revisiting. So we always try to take in feedback on what people are interested in and try to take in timely topics to report on to give as fresh of insights as possible. So quickly covering some key highlights, we go big on streaming audio here. We dive into its performance and we show with numbers what probably many of you are already familiar with, that streaming audio is typically worse per impression. It drives fewer conversions, fewer responses per actual impression, but actually drives comparable or perhaps even in some cases a bit better results per dollar due to the lower CPM. So we'll dive into those, and then Matt will go through some reasons we think that is based on actually the audience demographic differences between podcasts and streaming. Another hot topic is we go deeper on YouTube modeling. We talk about our new YouTube smart modeling, for which one of the factors is actually what percentage of a YouTube's channel is in the US versus abroad. Another thing that maybe many of you are familiar with, but what we'll show is that, at least by our data from what we're seeing, the more international a YouTube channel's audience is, the typically what we see is it seems like there's worse performance there, and we can kind of quantify that a bit for you and just share some more details there. But I think it may be the first time it's presented. I'm not sure. Another big one is Spotify video. It's a hot topic for everybody. I think there's a lot of confusion on my part, everybody's part of the industry, on what can be measured, what shows are accounted for, or what shows have opted in, what does it mean, how can we or others still report on it. So we go into more detail there. And one other thing is that we often get questions on these reports, and like Christy said, we can't fit, like, even if we put a lot of conclusions in the report, we still have things such as, what was the best day of week that, maybe we had the first 2 or 3 reports and it was like usually like Wednesday. So we kind of got a little tired of like putting it in there and figured maybe people are getting bored. But the trouble is, many of you are first time readers. So we wanted to make it be easier, using, of course, AI, to actually access all of the past insights that we've had. So Cam will be doing a live demo with that earlier. So we'll hope it works. It cooperates with us there. Fast figures. So we had about 100,000 campaigns over the past year. A reminder, we use the past 1 year of data just so the conclusions have more data to work with, not the last quarter. So yeah, roughly the past 12 months of data, 100,000 campaigns, about 700 advertisers, roughly 30 billion impressions tracked. The number did jump up a bit because we're counting streaming here too, so that helps pad the stats a bit. And onto the actual fast figures. So the most important, or the key thing at first, is you see the visitor rate and conversion rate. So these are how we quantify how effective impressions are at driving conversions or web visitors, or driving some action. So the visitor rate, say there was pretend there was a 1% visitor rate. What that would mean is that if you buy 100 impressions, then you could reasonably expect one of those you could reasonably expect one visitor to be attributed for your campaign. So with that, you can roughly determine how effective are these impressions at driving visitors, installs, conversions. And they're fairly similar as last time. I think they're pretty similar the last quarter. They don't typically change too much. But what the most immediate thing you'll probably notice is here we added streaming audio. And if you compare the streaming audio visitor rate to the podcasting conversion rate, you'll notice it's about half, roughly. So roughly, you might need about 2 times as many streaming impressions to drive roughly the same number of conversions as you would with podcast impressions. But also, as you probably is pretty somewhat obvious, that's not the whole picture. The whole picture more so is actually, well, what if you factor in the cost for these impressions? If streaming impressions are half as effective, but they cost a quarter as much, well, then they're going to perform 2 times as well for you. So on the right side there, we start to factor in the actual cost. So for podcasting, similar to what it was last time, the cost per visitor, about $8 when we factor in the average CPM we're seeing. I think we break out at the end here and in the slide of what might be more useful for you by per advertiser industry, since some brands might, like a financial services brand might, it might be a lot higher for this, but because their LTV is a lot higher per customer, the math totally works out here. So of course, what like the big stark thing is, oh wow, well look, the cost per visitor for streaming is like way lower, than what it is per pod, and we were pretty surprised about that at first. But I think, so yeah, good question, Brooke. It's actually a 30 and 14 day, which is one key thing. I think that makes streaming look a bit worse. I think in the full report, we're going to try to put it with 30 and 30 because it would make it look a little better. But from some of the tests we did, it didn't make it that much closer. But it's a good call out there, Brooke. But one thing worth noting is that streaming, we do notice that the advertisers we measure streaming with for, actually, when we look at them for just podcasting, we see for them roughly a $91 CPA. So it is a little bit misleading in that the CPA for streaming overall is, 87 to the general pod of 145. But then when you take the same set of advertisers, actually it is about the rough ballpark, the same cost per acquisition. But when we took the conversion rate for the streaming audio advertisers in podcasting, the conversion rate was actually like 0.03. So it was almost like 3 times as high as the average podcast conversion rate. So I think we'll have a little bit more detail in the general slide, but I think the takeaway here is that I think even with the same conversion windows, streaming impressions generally seem to be a little less performant, but that it's largely made up for in the lower CPM. So I think streaming clearly drives measurable performance that per impression can be comparable to podcasting. We don't have it broken out by platform currently, but I think Matt will talk a little bit more about some platform specific things.
We'll talk about streaming specific things for sure. Yeah.
So, all right. Going to video adoption trends. So before we'd only talk about YouTube here, we've added some more data for Spotify, but this slide still pure YouTube. And first, if you take a look at the black line, you'll see it sort of monotonously rising and going up there. And what this line shows is what percent of episodic campaigns that we track have both a podcast and a YouTube component in them. So not even necessarily what percent of podcasts are posting to YouTube, but what percent of campaigns. So it shows that actually the podcasters are putting the ads in YouTube and advertisers are buying them, even despite perhaps some, a lack of measurement there. And the purple line, roughly, it continues to stay roughly the same. That is, of all simulcast campaigns we see, what percent of those impressions, when you add up the podcast downloads and YouTube views, are YouTube. So, Matt or Cam, do you think this black line will ever hit 100%, or will plateau sooner?
Cam, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, looking at this, it's going up and to the right. I think as technology is improving, there's ways for podcasters to, one, better monetize their content because there's another channel for consumers to engage with their podcasts. There's not every podcast is going to have a massive production, studio or team that can help compile and edit these videos, but there's technology that's making it way easier. I think 18 months, if not at 100%, we're at 99%. It just makes sense of where video plays within podcasts that it's going to continue to climb.
Yeah, I think we saw something like 80% of the top 100 are posting to YouTube, something like that. And you expect them to be posting to YouTube. They probably have the capital to have a production company and video editing software and nice cameras and stuff like that. But yeah, Cam, I agree with you. I think an iPhone camera does a pretty darn good job of capturing video. There's a lot of free video editing tools out there. And I think giving people the option to watch or listen is probably what consumers want based on what we're seeing here. This graph kind of helps to dictate that. So I would expect to see this number go up to pretty darn close to 100% over time.
Sooner or later. That's a good.
Sooner or later, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, Jack and Monica. It does look. I think the data is like not exactly perfect because some of it is dependent upon us having the simulcast link in our system. It does look like there's a pretty big boost in June there. I agree. Maybe just at that point it was like some month that we kind of added more. So I wouldn't necessarily look at like, June was a crazy month with like everybody just switched over and YouTube did a huge push. I would kind of more just look at it, as a steady rise where more and more shows are just saying like, hey, we got to be everywhere. And it's probably going to continue.
And answering Sam's question here too. So what does the purple line sort of signify? That's correct. So the share of impressions that are happening on YouTube versus all impressions, which includes like listening on audio, listening to the Apple Podcast app, listening on Spotify, so on and so forth. You got it.
Does that also include views on Rumble or Spotify video?
I think this slide doesn't. No.
Okay.
And maybe that's a perfect slide for the next PPP too. Now
Yeah, I don't think Rumble and Spotify video are huge portions for most shows, but that's a good
Yeah.
segue to Spotify video next, Cam. So, all right, a quick poll for the audience here. If a show opts into spot to distributing their content on Spotify video, its baked in ads can be tracked for Spotify listeners on for those Spotify listeners listening on audio, those Spotify listeners watching on video, both or or neither. All right, a pretty mixed bag here, which I think reflects based on what I've seen, like the state of the industry. I think a lot of confusion and just kind of unknown since it's so new. The answer is neither, actually. That if a show decides to distribute its content on Spotify video, none of the baked in ad content can be measured, regardless if somebody some user on Spotify watches it on audio or video, none of it can be measured. So, in effect, it creates a measurement black hole in a sense. So, whereas before, we had the kind of the YouTube black hole. So Spotify video, in a sense, creates a bit of a similar one for baked in ads. Now, there's a couple caveats there, which I'll get to in the blue box in a second. But so yeah, the key thing at first is just there are measurement limitations introduced when shows opt in to Spotify video in regards to their baked in ads. So, but first off, how many shows are even opted in to Spotify video? How big are we? So, based on our data, what we see is of the top 100 shows that we track, which maybe is not exactly perfect, but ballpark about 13% of the top 100 shows have opted into distributing their content, their video content through Spotify. So that means that when a Spotify user consumes any of the show's content on Spotify, none of the analytics or listen data get passed back to the hosting platform or third-party analytics providers such as ourselves. We look at the top 500 shows, it seems there's a few more shows down. It gets maybe a little bit bigger, but overall, it doesn't seem to be like it's greater than like 80% of shows or so probably are not yet opted into Spotify video. Maybe they will, maybe not. I think it's a little different than YouTube because they're not putting a video on YouTube is it's different because if you don't opt into Spotify video, users on Spotify can already consume your content. They already can, listen to the pure audio version. Unlike where if you don't put it on YouTube, nobody on YouTube can watch it unless they go to a different app. So it's a little bit of a different thing than publishing to YouTube. So yeah, it's not exactly comparable. Whereas, probably most of these shows, at least 80% are probably opted into or posting to YouTube video. So yeah, the key takeaway when these shows opt in, the measurement for baked in ads is no longer possible. One bright point, which I actually learned recently, and I think what it is that maybe some of you are familiar with is that Spotify video is opening up dynamic ad insertion for some shows. I think it's my understanding, my understanding is that, and I put a link there. Maybe Christy or somebody could post it in the chat. Is that generally dynamic video insertion, ad video insertion will be available to folks in April. I think there's a few select publishers on Megaphone who can do it now, and it does seem that those DAI ads may in fact be pixelable, which is a bit of a bright spot, I would say. I think it doesn't really address baked in ads, but I think there may be a bit of a bright spot there. So yeah, more to come. We hope on that. But another thing to keep in mind with it, if a show opts into Spotify video, its consumption on Apple or elsewhere can still be pixeled. It's just you don't get the Spotify portion. So in effect, what we have to do is just more modeling, which it's doable. But if your aim is the most accurate measurement possible, it doesn't exactly help your case to do more modeling. So that's that. And one, yeah, two other things. If a show is opted into Spotify video, they can pass us their play and stream counts by integrating with us. So we don't, it's a sense similar to us getting the YouTube view counts. We just get them and we can count them towards campaigns and model for them. So there is an option for that, fortunately. And yeah, last thing is so Apple Podcast, just because it's so timely, they announced that they can support video differently via HLS or live streaming in a sense, which means that the all the usual attribution IP to IP will actually work for that. The hosting platforms might need a little bit to do a little bit of work, but the good news is that it isn't opening up another black hole for measurement. That baked in ads and other ads can actually be pixeled like usual. So, Mattercam, any thoughts on this topic? Or...
I think an initial thought that I have is we may be getting closer to impressions and not just downloads with some of these updates. So that's a little bit exciting. So maybe brings the impression number to parity with some other channels, whether that's like whatever viewable impressions, right, and things like that. So from my perspective, this shift or change, albeit it may create more silos in the industry in terms of measurement, it may also get us closer to what we're used to buying from an impressions perspective in other channels. So there's a good and a maybe bad across this, but worth calling it out. And Cam, what do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm worried or relieved to see the mixed bag of poll results. I think helping just elevate this, visibility or lack of visibility when it comes to Spotify video adoption. I'm relieved that there are so few shows within that top 100 that are currently opted in. Um, Maybe there's the opportunity to do more like faked in with DAI targeting on those video components. But I think just generally raising the awareness of what is possible when it comes to those baked in ads, because it's certainly a question that we field, day to day and helping monitor and set up advertiser campaigns. So the more awareness, hopefully the fewer questions we have around this, but also the more I think power in unifying that voice around the need to get closer to real-time measurement for Spotify video.
For sure. And we probably in the next week or two will have a new alert on our dash. If you have a campaign on a show that is opted into Spotify video and the show is not integrated with us to send us the counts, we will have a flag on our dash to make that obvious to you, to the buyer, the seller, whoever. And also I think we'll have a flag too on the actual show page, probably the next week or two as well, to indicate if a show is opted into Spotify video to try to make it more clear what's happening. So, all right. Well, I think I took.
We also have,
Okay.
and sorry to interrupt, but we also have really clear instructions for how to start sending that data to Podscribe as well. So being on the publisher side, you'll have the very clear directions on how to do that, so we can start showcasing that in the dashboard.
Right. Maybe Christy or if you want to drop that link for integrate with Podscribe into the chat too. So, all right. Well, I think I took way too much of my time again. So let me pass it to Cam.
No worries. So yeah, excited to highlight some of the performance by YouTube subscribers. Back at Podcast Movement Dallas, we presented on stage in partnership with Oxford Road a white paper analyzing the performance between audio focused and YouTube focused and sort of every percentage in between podcasts that are simulcast to both the RSS feed as well as uploaded to YouTube, and analyze what's the difference between promo code redemption and post-purchase survey results for those shows that are represented in audio and video. And it sort of broke my initial assumption where, as a consumer, I would expect if I'm listening to a podcast or if I'm watching a podcast, the prime time to convert is while I'm watching the video, right? I'm seated at my desk. I've got the video up. I'm not driving. I can, go and engage with the advertiser or go and convert. But what we found was that YouTube was actually about 30% fewer promo code redemptions or post-purchase survey results compared to their audio counterpart. And we had some great feedback from that presentation. And one of those was the international nature of some of these podcasts. So we took that a step further to analyze what are the average promo code redemptions per impression for podcasts that on the right are 100% US focused subscribers, and on the far left, 25% makeup of US subscribers, 75% non US. And the data was very telling, sort of validating that we do see, more than 2x the conversion rate or promo code redemption rate for pure US focused subscribers and podcasts, 0.014% compared to the 0.006% redemption rate for those non-US subscriber shows. And this is, again, feedback that we receive quite often is around the inability to measure those walled gardens like YouTube, Spotify video, Rumble with the same level of accuracy or granularity that we do for audio, where we can actually pixel the show, actually pixel and receive IP addresses for each individual, listener or exposed household. We're now incorporating a smarter YouTube modeling or simulcast modeling when it comes to taking this data into consideration. So this US versus non-US geographic makeup is now a covariate in our smarter simulcast modeling. We're also taking into consideration where the ad is in that specific episode. So if it's earlier in the episode or later in the episode, giving more credit to those ads that are promoted sooner than later. The ad length, we don't have it today, but we are working on incorporating whether that was a host read ad or a producer ad in the video, as well as if there was a visual component, whether the host has the product on their desk while they're speaking about it, or if there's a pop-up graphic, as well as incorporating if there's any clickable environment links within either the subtitle or the description of that video, that we can actually get some semblance of real data to inform the model. So all of this to say, as you saw, the rise of video in simulcast within an episodic buy perspective is only growing. We're really excited to sort of incorporate this smarter YouTube modeling because we think it merits it. And we definitely understood and heard that our previous approach needed a little bit of a tune-up to have a more accurate view of performance. So this is now available. You can toggle this within the attribution settings to see how this smarter YouTube modeling affects or impacts the campaigns that you're measuring. So
Yeah,
I
it's
do
not
also want
on by default, right?
correct.
Right.
To you guys or to the audience, if there are any other thoughts on what data could be incorporated to inform a smarter approach to modeling YouTube.
Right now, and quick thing, it's none of this is to say that the main or the top goal isn't to actually get real measurement from YouTube. So talking to them, of course, I think there's a decent shot at it happening. It might be through, some sort of clean room setup, not exactly in the usual way. So that's still, of course, the main goal. But yeah, in the meantime, our aim is to provide, as smart a modeling as possible. And yeah, generally, Brooke, so generally the smarter modeling is a bit lower than the existing modeling, which takes just the same audio conversion rate and applies it to YouTube. You can adjust that slider to say make the YouTube views worth like 70% of the audio downloads, which we roughly recommend based on earlier analyses. But overall with the smart modeling by default, it comes out to maybe like 80-ish% on average when we look across advertisers. It depends a lot on what channels they're buying. But yeah, generally the newer model, it's a little more clear that audio it's a little more clear in the output of the model that audio drives some more conversions than the same number of YouTube views. Although there are instances, I think, where, if the show is like 100% US subscribers, the YouTube ad is like right at the start of the episode, the podcast ad is right at the end. Maybe the YouTube ad's like a little better in some cases too, possibly, or it's like a really good video read with the host wearing the product or something. I think there are some cases where the video could be better, but I think in general, we have the audio driving some more results. So That's a good point too. Yeah, Jeff, with the age, yeah, and algorithmic discovery percent. I think most YouTube views we've heard too are from people just being shown it in their discovery feed, which is why we think to a large degree podcast downloads do perform better because the viewers are more loyal. They know the host. It's hard work to listen to a podcast. Whereas YouTube, you go there, there's like a bazillion videos. You don't know who necessarily it is, and you just kind of tune in and maybe you drop out sooner, but you watch
You have
some of
you have
it.
to seek out the audio, right? Like you have to lean in and find that specific show or specific episode. Like, yeah, to your point, I've got 20 recommendations of other videos on the same screen of the episode that I'm watching.
Which is why we see the engagement rate on YouTube videos drop so significantly so early on in a video, whereas in the audio versions we see a slight decline over time. But it seems the algorithm doesn't necessarily bring like the top quality audience in terms of advertiser audience. But that's all things that we're thinking about in terms of this new smarter YouTube modeling. And that brings us to an audience composition. So comparing podcasts and streaming audiences, we're excited to be able to bring to you for the first time streaming benchmarks. We're going to continue to bring streaming benchmarks to the PPB every single edition now. But we thought it might be interesting to do a bit more of a deep dive on what is the difference in the audience composition. So before we do, we have a quick poll that kind of asks you all maybe something everyone knows already, but curious what people think. So when comparing podcast and streaming audio audiences, thank you, Chrissy. Sorry. Who has more disposable income? Is it streaming audio audiences, podcast audiences? Both are the same, or no idea? Just show me the answer. So is it streaming audio with more disposable income, podcast? They seem about the same. Or I got no idea.
Well, 1.2 for streaming audio audiences that we measure ads on.
Yeah, right. That's a good point, man.
Right,
That's a very, very
right.
good point, right? That we measure ads on. We'll get into the
So
distinction
it
there
may be
too.
a little biased, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think you may have just given away the answer. Oh, what did
Well,
it seems like we have a lot of responses coming in, which is great. So streaming audio audiences have more disposable, about 23%, 65%. So two-thirds of you think podcast audiences have more disposable. A couple people think both are the same. 10 of you just wanted to see the answer. Well, now you've got a good idea of what the answer is. I'm going to leave you in suspense for one slide. Keep that in the back of your mind, and we're going to answer that question here. But as we dive into the comparison of the two different audiences, we wanted to look at a couple of different ways to slice and dice this data. So the first way that we're looking at this is to look at the total podcast audience and broken out by share of that podcast audience for listenership in the state, or by state, should I say. And the same thing with streaming audio. So share of streaming audio listenership broken out by state. And when you compare the differences of the shares between podcast and streaming audio, so for instance, if 5% of podcast listeners are in California, 3% of streaming audio listeners are in California, that difference is 2. And that difference would be 2 and would be blue on the left-hand side because podcast is bigger than streaming. That's what you're seeing here. And so a couple of kind of interesting things to call out. So on the very far left, where the blue bars are above the middle line there, that means podcasts are a larger share of the listenership by state than streaming. On the very far right, it means streaming. So those red bars, a higher share of streaming audiences compared to podcasts. And so a couple of things to kind of call out here. One, generally speaking, like coastal regions like Massachusetts, California, New York, Oregon, they show really, really high podcast preference compared to ad-supported streaming audio, which I think is an important aspect here. And then we see things like Middle America and southern regions like Texas, Florida, Illinois, so on and so forth, indexing higher than streaming, which I love to see. Now, this is interesting, I think, from a planning point of view, right? If I'm trying to figure out what my budget allocation should be for a national campaign or even a regional campaign, this kind of information kind of help figure out where you should be putting your budgets across podcasts and streaming audio. Also, too, if let's say you're mid-campaign and you need incremental reach and you're trying to figure out where to find that incremental reach, this might be helpful to allow you to decide, should you be buying more podcasts or more streaming streaming based on the region that you're targeting here. And so again, becomes really, really interesting. Another thing, when you look at sort of that middle section where you don't see a whole lot of bar, so not a lot of difference between podcast listening and streaming audio listening, what becomes really important there, I think, is being able to optimize your frequency across both of those channels. And one of the things that we brought out over the last few months here is a smart serve product. So basically, it allows us to become the third-party ad server and allows you to control that frequency across podcasts and streaming, depending on where you're buying. And so, within those sort of like center states there becomes a little bit more important to manage that across two different channels. So really interesting data here. I don't know if Cam, Pete, you guys have any thoughts on this. I'll pause for that, but yeah, interesting data.
I was surprised to
Yeah.
see Illinois so far to the right as far as streaming consumption, but then I remember like all of my Chicago buddies think anything south of Chicago is like southern. So, I was labeled as a hick, being in central Illinois. I was like, there's so much more south than us.
There's more than just Chicago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We are going to try and break things out by DMA as well in the official PPB report. So you can maybe dive in a little bit more on the population centers of these individual states, maybe give it a little bit more granular view. But state level at least gives you a good understanding as to how this kind of shakes out. All right. So that's at the state level. Let's answer the question now. So we had a decent number of people who guessed podcasts as at least 2/3 of the audience here guessed podcasts had more disposable income. And that portion of our audience is right. And we saw this pretty, I would say, clearly across every single different way to assess income, household income, net asset value, more or less disposable income. The insight was pretty much the same across all of those different ways to slice and dice this data. And so really quickly, here's how you're reading these graphs. So on the left graph, where you see that 4.8 and 4.7 number, it's the same methodology we just showed on the previous slide, which we look at the share of podcast listenership, the share of streaming listenership, and whatever the differences between the two. And very clearly, you see this difference in the podcast audience more often than not has more disposable income. The streaming audience more often than not has less disposable income. You also see something very interesting in terms of the level of achievement, or sorry, a level of education that has been achieved, where we see that generally speaking, and I hate to say it, I think we left out the names of the jobs on names of the education on this graph, so we'll add that back in. But the far left one, which is streaming audio over indexed, that's that's high school. So generally speaking, we see streaming audio over index on some high school. And then the one that's really small is doctorate. Thank you very much. Love that. Quick change by the team here. So doctorate about the same. And then we start to see some college, grad school, and college very clearly now flips back over to over index on podcast audiences. So podcast audiences typically more educated and more disposable income. Streaming audiences typically have a lower achievement of education, a little bit less disposable income. And frankly, it kind of makes sense. And we talked about it a little bit in the beginning here, but generally speaking, streaming audio or ad-supported streaming audio is typically a free tier. A free tier that's being offered by whoever the streaming audio platform is. And there is a premium offering within those various places, right? Spotify and Pandora, you can pay to have no ads. So what we're seeing here are the people that do not pay and are being hit by ads, right? So it sort of makes sense that we see more disposable income on the podcast side. And I think this becomes interesting data to help from a planning perspective based on things like advertiser industry, or are you a luxury brand or not a luxury brand? If I'm a home goods brand, interestingly enough, when we look at home ownership between these two audiences, it's about the same. So if I'm a home goods brand on both podcasts and streaming, pretty good channel to be reaching the audiences that I'm looking for. But if we're talking about, let's say, high-end furnishings, I'm more likely to perhaps see better results on podcasts. If I'm talking about, let's say, CPG or more budget fashion, things like that, I might want to focus more on streaming audio based on these kinds of insights. So this kind of allows us to dive in a little bit more on, based on my industry, my offering, where should I be focusing my budget across podcasts and streaming? So very, very interesting data. Cam, Pete, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
I mean, the premium gap is a great thing to call out. All of it to say, I don't think it's impossible to still reach those, maybe individuals or households with a more disposable income through streaming audio. I think of like the gym or the grocery store or QSR. So I think regardless, this shouldn't be to say, disregard streaming if you're only trying to
Right.
reach this type of audience.
Right.
R- Right. Well, to the other thing, I mean, we do see that the performance per impression seems to be generally lower per streaming, but it seems like roughly the difference is more or less priced in with the lower CPMs too. So, I think it's sort of interesting to see how the market is already sort of intuitively
Work it out.
incorporated
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Right.
yeah.
Exactly. And, to Cam's point, right? This isn't necessarily like, one channel versus another. It makes sense from our perspective. And by the way, for those of you that have been here before, you have seen the reach curve that we've generated for both podcasts and streaming audio. But it makes sense if I'm looking for a wide reach campaign that we should be focusing on both channels. Only looking at podcasts only hits a certain portion of the US, but podcasts and streaming audio combined together can hit upwards of 85% of the US population. And so, from that perspective, wide reach. If we're looking for wide reach, I should say, both channels together work very, very well. And I think that's probably one of the more important points, too. This isn't to say one channel is better than another. This is to say one channel versus another might be more beneficial based on your target audience. So that's reach. That's the general review of audiences. One final thing that we thought might help to kind of drive this home a little bit. We have in the past talked about incrementality in terms of performance or conversion incrementality comparing podcasts and streaming audio. And just to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about incrementality, incrementality literally means if I am running a campaign and I am seeing conversions being attributed to this campaign, how do I know if those conversions happened because of this campaign or happened because of all of the other marketing or word of mouth or brand awareness from that advertiser in other channels? Right. So how do we know that in an isolated view that it is podcast or it is streaming actually driving these conversions and not just noise elsewhere? And what we see here is the median incrementality by channel for those advertisers that are only buying podcast ads sees the highest level of incrementality within this graph. Those that are buying audio ads only typically see lower incrementality, right? So that's that 10.4% number at the bottom. So 26% against 10%. I think you go back to the same thing that we talked about before. Response rates, might be lower in streaming, but the cost is that much lower, and therefore your incremental effect in terms of a per dollar basis might be fairly similar between these two. But it certainly makes sense based on what we're saying here that the podcast audience has higher or achieves higher purchase incrementality, more disposable income, right? And when you combine the two, you sort of see the power of running both podcast and streaming audio. That's that 20% incrementality number in the middle. So you see how they work really well together, depending on who you are as an advertiser. But from that perspective, it sort of makes sense to us. Podcast audiences are a bit harder to find. They have a tendency to pay for products so that it's ad free. And podcast is just one of those channels where you can reach that audience where it is not necessarily ad free. You can obviously subscribe to some shows' premium networks and remove ads for sure, but that doesn't seem to be the norm necessarily. And so podcast audiences a little bit harder to find. Streaming a little bit easier to find around. A lot of people listen to music. And so from that perspective, those streaming audiences can be found in other channels. And so they're a little bit easier to find, which is why we see less incrementality. Those streaming impressions are competing with other media channels at a higher rate than what podcast impressions are. And so this is like just a nice way to kind of tie a nice bow around the differences that we're seeing in the audiences and how that might translate to incrementality or performance, generally speaking. So yeah, really, really interesting stuff. And then one other fun fact. We did try to dive into some interesting stats within the audience compositions, and this is a little bit different. So what we did here is we looked at what the share of the podcast audience was within a particular state, and compared that to the share of the population in the U.S. So if let's say we see I don't know, 5% of the podcast audience in California, but California accounts for 10% of the US population. That would be an under index, right? So we see a higher population in California as a share of the US population versus the share of people that are listening. That's not the case. That's opposite. But still, that's what this is showing. This is indexing the listenership against the US population. And this is where those indexes flip. What I mean by that is we see an over index in one channel and an under index in the other. So interesting already. I think one of the coolest ones that we saw pop out was Washington, D.C. So this is just a blow up version of Washington, D.C. And we see a massive disparity between the two. We see way more podcast consumption in terms of the share of the podcast audience against US population versus ad supported streaming. And it just kind of like, it's one of those gut check stats where we take a look at the podcast presidency, right? We had a lot of presidential candidates that were using podcasts as a part of their campaign. This past weekend with Theo Vaughn, Lex Friedman podcast, Impulsive with Logan Paul, the Sean Ryan show, right? All these shows where Trump went on, and then Kamala went on, Alex Cooper and the Howard Stern show, and Brené Brown and Charlemagne the God. Like it really was the podcast presidency. You can kind of see it in one graph here, the preference for podcasts, at least versus ad-supported streaming. So we thought that was a pretty decent view of the podcast presidency there. So I'll go ahead and pause. I don't know, Cam, Pete, you've got any thoughts on that, or we can just move on to the next fun thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely what we felt in the news. I'd be curious to see what the actual demographics breakdown of that is. It's all, 75 age plus, and the podcast consumption was on a BlackBerry. People trying to figure out what the heck a podcast is, but yeah, we see it in the data for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, one quick thing I think Kristen's asked, or sorry, not Kristen, Linda is asking in the chat sort of about like, oh, can podcast, aren't more and more podcast listeners subscribing and opting out of ads as well? You're kind of going back and forth there. So I think maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think generally it's pretty hard to opt out of ads for podcasts. I mean, because like I don't really. I mean, there's some sort of bootleg apps that maybe kind of like clear out the ads for you in sort of a maybe sketchy way. But generally, I mean, even if you pay for Spotify Premium, the podcast ads will still be in there, and I think that maybe is one of the reasons here for podcasting. As Matt's kind of been saying, having a more affluent audience because they can as much. But I don't know, Matt or Cam, if you think I'm misunderstanding. Oh, they skipped the.
They might.
Matt,
Well,
Cam,
the Spotify Premium, you will still get the baked in ads within podcasts. You likely will not be targeted with a dynamically inserted ad, but also too, like Wondery has Wondery Plus where it does strip out the ads. NPR has NPR Plus where it does strip out the ads. So that option is very much still available, but it doesn't seem like it happens a lot, right? We're not seeing in any data where we're seeing a massive drop, let's say week over week or month over month in those addressable consumers within, let's say, the RSS feed, because they're all switching off to a more premium feed with no ads. So it doesn't seem to be a large portion of the audience based on what we see. All right, and that's the podcast presidency right there. So let's dive in on Cam. Could you please introduce us to, we need a better name for it, but PPB GPT? Is that what we're calling this?
Yeah, Podscribe AI assistant. I don't know if we have an official branded name for it yet, but I don't know how I got so lucky to share some of the more exciting announcements. But I'll share my screen. This is a live demo, so please give us some grace if there is any wackiness to it. But we recognize that the PPB is a beast. I think in its unedited format of what we trim before we present on this webinar, it's upwards of like 80 slides. And we often field questions of, how should we expect this performance to compare to the benchmark? And digging through a massive PowerPoint presentation can be a bit challenging. So in addition to the Podscribe dashboard, you'll see this is actually live in the UI today. We have our Podscribe AI that you can ask pretty much any question, not just specific to the PPB, but I will showcase some of those questions here. If I wanted to know what some of those previously reported on metrics on, such as what ad length is the best performer. We'll let this generate, but I can now query previous PPBs and find what key insight should I be comparing based on my current campaign performance. And we can see that impression buys at a 45-second ad length were best performing with a $42 cost per acquisition. Episodic buys performing best from a cost per acquisition standpoint at $78. So this is a quick and easy way to dig into previous reports and analyze how your campaigns are performing against those 700 other advertisers that feed this analysis. I'll showcase too, just in the purpose of time, what device types are best performing, and we can see the previous insights that we've reported in those PPBs. So just a really clean and efficient way to dig into those insights and ask questions. In addition to this, we currently have it live within the research data. So I've come here on Crime Junkie. Maybe I come back to a different show and ask it to summarize the previous episodes like I did with Crime Junkie, where I can pull up a specific show page. You can see that it's referencing Joe Rogan of what are the top sponsors found in the recent episodes. And while that's loading, we can see the summary that it provided for Crime Junkie of what were the conversations, what were the topics within those most recent 10 episodes. Here I ran that query as well to see the sponsorships, but here we can see Squarespace on it, American Beverage Association, and Hulu. Again, the joys of doing a live demo. Wait, I think we do have a poll on the AI, but yeah, any other thoughts or comments?
I was going to throw one thing out there, which is, there's a lot of data on the Podscribe dashboard, and I think just getting your hands around all the data is challenging. And this is one step towards getting your hands around that data. So, without further ado, we've got a question for everybody. I think everyone is trying to apply AI to everything, and applying AI the right way to make our jobs easier is really the name of the game. And we're thinking about that a lot every single day here at Podscribe. So based on what you've seen now, what light bulbs kind of went off? What would you like to use an AI chatbot for within the construct of media buying, planning? Are you more interested in analyzing campaign performance and insights, audience insights and creative testing? Looking through past PPBs, again, the PPB GPT, say that 10 times fast. You want to see all of it, or do you have any ideas that are not in here that you'd like to voice your opinion on? We would love to hear from you. So you can either select that or go ahead and reach out to us at partnerships@podscribe.com. We'd love to get that feedback and start adding that to the roadmap. Or all of the above is the top answer. Of course it is. Media buying and planning, about a fifth of us. Analyzing campaign performance and insights, about a fifth of us. One person wants to reach out. Please do. We'd love to hear from you at partnerships@podscribe.com. Love to hear what you got.
Right. So one quick point on how the Bernard here works is right now, at least when you're going on Joe Rogan's page and you're querying it, what we do is we just pass the audience data that we have there, the sponsor data and the transcript data to an instance of ChatGPT right underneath. So it's nothing crazy. We're just passing it all the data that we have, the public data on the research page there to Rogan. So in theory, yeah, you could use it for anything like, you could even pass in your own brand safety prompt that's like tuned to an advertiser. You could, yeah, query about audience data. Yeah. More about sponsors. What are reads like? So yeah, we're trying to make all that data is accessible now per show and per episode. Soon we'll make it so you can query across all shows, and then soon your campaign data too. So more and more data is getting fed to it. Right now it's just like per show that info that's there in the research. But Yeah, definitely. We think it should help make it easier to find shows, review insights, um, and yeah, much more just to be useful. So, all right.
Back to you, Christy.
All right, thanks everyone. That was a great presentation, and we're about to hit the 1 p.m. mark, so we're finishing on time. Again, thank you all for joining. And if you would like to request a demo, you could scan the QR code and also select benchmark report if you want to get 20% off your first 3 months. And if you want to get in touch with any of our lovely presenters here today, you can also reach out to us at contact@podscribe.com or partnerships@podscribe.com.
Thank you,
And that
everybody.
concludes it. Thanks,
Thanks for
everyone. Have
coming.
a great rest of your
Yeah.
Monday.
Great to see you all. Thank you.